Hey everybody, welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to get from a super rough sketch like this to a fully functional 3D asset like this with the help of open source software, Stable Diffusion, and Blender 3D. Let's get started. You may have seen my 2D asset video, maybe you're even coming from there, and in that video I made these objects, right? So a chest, not a mace actually, you told me it was a flail and you're right, and this potion here. So I do want to manage some expectations. Now, Stable Diffusion is excellent at making 2D objects like this, but directly converting them into 3D is not possible. So far, right? I mean, maybe next week something's going to release that's going to just blow Stable Diffusion out of the water and create 3D models out of nothing. But so far, all the 3D AIs are creating quite simple objects that aren't directly usable in game design, right? So I will not be making one of these objects because it's actually surprisingly complex, right? So we have to actually manually model all these individual elements, the jewel, all this stuff in Blender. And there are artists that do that better than I can and have created tutorials just the traditional way, right? To make game-ready assets. What I will be doing is showing you some ways to make simpler objects, like weapons, like the ones I just showed you. So that's definitely possible. They look great and aren't incredibly difficult to make. So with that said, let's get started. Obviously, you're going to need an installation of Stable Diffusion. I have one running locally. It's the automatic 1111 web UI. And in my opinion, if you can run it locally on your GPU, this is the best installation to get. I can only recommend it. It's kept up to date, and it has a ton of extra features that aren't just Stable Diffusion, right? You have some extras. You can upscale your images, which of course are pretty small, coming straight out of the AI, into very large images with very little detail loss, right? So that's a cool extra. And, you have a history here if you want. You can see all the stuff that's generated. You can even train and have a ton of extra settings. So definitely, if you can, get this one. That said, none of the things I do today aren't possible in other installations, right? You can do an online version of Dream Studio. So click the link in the description, pick what works best for you and follow those instructions. And then you can continue on with this tutorial. Next, you need Photoshop or any other image manipulation software. I'm going to do very simple things here that you can also do in GIMP. And you're going to need a 512 by 512 canvas in there with a black background. So just create that, get that ready. Very simple. And next, you're going to need Blender. Now, I'm going to expect some rudimentary knowledge of Blender, right? Some basic navigation. You need to understand some modifiers, basic tools like extrusion, beveling, and so forth. So check out a tutorial if you don't know how to do that. And if you do, then you'll be able to follow me very simply with some basic knowledge of Blender. So I won't go too into details here. And we're going to start in Photoshop. So go into your Photoshop project, make a new layer, and we're going to give the image-to-image algorithm something to work with, right? A basic shape. Because if we just let it create objects on its own, it's going to do a weird angle, and we need a flat top-down view of the object we want to create. You'll see why in just a second. So with that said, I am going to actually select, use the pen tool, right, to form a basic shape, because we are going to put some gradients and some more detail in there. And we're going to make a cutlass, right, like a pirate sword. So I'm going to, make some details here. Just shape whatever you want. Don't think too much about it because Stable will change your results a little bit. Then make your selection, feather 0, 0 feathering, and mask your layer, just in case you want to change that layer. Now, of course, you can't see anything right now, so we're going to do a gradient tool and pick the colors we want. Now I want kind of a little gradient going from light, metal. Actually, I'm going to go a little into blue with the metal. That's kind of a good trick to get good metal colors. To a darker one. Just a little like this. Now don't go too into detail. Now we're going to do the handle. So name that. That's the blade. Next up is the handle. And again, just shape that real quick. I want the handle to go up a little like this. So I'm going to do that. Now make your selection, 0 feathering, mask again. And now we can gradient again, just have a little bit of a color in there. Some shading so we can tell Stable that we want a little bit of shading. Now make sure this image fills up as much of your canvas as you can. That's why I did it diagonally like this, while still making sure it has some space, some little bit of a frame. All right, and now one final step, I want to add some noise because there are some solid colors here, and Stable has some problems with that, right? It won't be creative enough if we don't give it some noise to work with. So I'm going to select a black color and just fill on top of this. Then go to Filter, Add Noise, and you can really leave it in colorful noise. 47 amount is fine. And then set it to Screen. You can turn down the opacity a little bit if you want. And now here's the trick. You put all your layers that you drew into a folder. Just call that Weapon, for example, and make sure your noise layer applies just to those because we don't want any objects generating in this black area, right? We want it to be exclusively where we drew some stuff. And now we can export this. And for my exports, I always make a folder called Iterations. And you'll see why, because if we want to change some stuff, right, we can make several different iterations. So I'm going to save that as one, as a JPEG is fine. You can turn down the quality, it doesn't really matter. And now we go into Stable, Image to Image, and put the image in here. Iterations 1. And there it is. Now it's time to enter our prompt. And I fiddle around a ton with this. The style I'm going for today is more like the hand-painted, kind of Sea of Thieves, World of Warcraft style. So I'm going to enter 3D Blender render of a cute RPG sword. So the word cute for some reason helps. That's why I leave it in there. RPG works well as well. It understands that I kind of want that fantasy style. And describe some details, right? We want a golden handle, a clean blade, for example, and now hand-painted textures. That makes those textures in the style I want. Add centered, so it makes sure to stay within the frame. And smooth lighting, because we want to do our lighting in the game, of course. It's for a real-time game engine, which means I don't want too much shading in there. I just want some basic shading so we can tell what different parts of the object are, but not anything dramatic. And what I found has helped is describing that it's a top-down view. That way it doesn't try to turn our sword in any way. And now the sampling steps 20 is fine for now. We just want to see where it takes us and turn the denoising strength to 0.5 because this determines how far it can stray away from our original image. And I like our image. I don't want it to go too far away. Turn the batch count up, depending on, how much time you're willing to wait for, and hit generate. And here are our first results. You can tell it really did recognize what we want, that, this should be the handle, this should be the blade, and we have several options to choose from. So this is kind of a cool style, right? This is generally what I want. But of course, obviously, it's still a little too simple. This is not usable in a game at all yet, but it was the first step, and that's all I wanted. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to choose some parts that I like. So for example, I like this blade. It's kind of detailed, it's rough, but I don't like the handle. So I'm going to copy this image out of here, go into Photoshop, and paste this over the very top. I like that. Now I'm going to go in and find a handle that I like, just vaguely, right? It's still going to change. This is a cool handle, so I'm going to pick this one, copy this, and paste it in here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to very roughly select the handle on this image. It's all black anyway, doesn't matter. Actually, make sure I take this part too. And now I'm going to hit mask. And that way I have the handle I like on the blade I like. And with that chance, I'm also going to move my handle a little bit because it did rotate the whole thing. It's not a very straight sword right here. That's of course due to my original image, so that's my fault. And now we have a nice straight sword, and I'm going to save that in my iterations folder as number 2. And we're going to bring that back in here. So replace our original image with number 2, and I can leave all the settings and just run it again. All right, cool. So you can tell it stood closer to the handle we like, stayed closer. But I gotta say, it kind of ruined the blade, so I don't love that. So I'm gonna select the new handle that I like, which is this one here. It has nice detail. I'm gonna bring that into Photoshop and select it again as we had before. But I'm gonna stick with that original one, copy this as iteration number 3. Put it in. And now we need to adjust our prompt a little bit, right? So I'm going to call simple blade and maybe remove the cute now that we have, more iterations, we have more to work with. And turn down the denoising strength so it doesn't stray too far away. I'm going to put it to 0.3 and turn up the sampling steps so we get generally more detail. And generate. Good, and now you can tell we got some more detail on our handle especially. That's really neat, and I personally like this handle the most. It has the most detail. So what we're going to do next is bring this in here, and now we're going to adjust parts separately. So we can also, if we want more specific things on the handle, change stuff here in Photoshop. For example, I like this little round thing, but I want that to be a jewel. So we can try to maybe just draw an emerald in here. Make sure you're on a new layer. And I'm just going to paint this part in here and then go into blending options, for example, and put a bevel on that, right? And just give that some detail. This is, of course, just to help Stable figure out what I want. And I'm going to duplicate my noise layer here and bring it over top. And make sure it's just affecting that thing I just drew, just to give it some more detail to work with. And now I'm going to save this as another iteration, and I'm going to show you how to adjust individual objects. It's quite simple. All you need to do is bring your image in here and then crop. So we can hold Shift and crop it down here and just, select the part you want to edit and change it to the prompt to sword handle with an emerald jewel. And then leave the rest and click generate. So check that out. It immediately recognized that I wanted this to be an emerald and kind of embedded it into the blade, which is really cool, into the handle, which is really cool. So now I can pick out which one I like the best. These all have really neat details that I like. So it's kind of hard to choose one, but we're just going to have to. I like that the emerald in this one kind of repeats in these rings, so I'm going to take this one. But before I copy this one, remember, our source file here in Photoshop is just 512 by 512, and this detail we generated is in total that size. So I am going to upscale this and turn this image size up to 2048. Before we go any further. And now I'm going to copy this, paste it in here, turn the opacity down a little so we see what we're doing, and just move this new generation over the top of our old one. Just make sure it matches up roughly. It's a little different from the old one anyway, so it's never going to match up perfectly. But just try. And now I'm going to put a mask on here. Take my brush, make sure it's a nice big brush with a soft hardness, and remove, just make those transitions a little cleaner. And now next I want this blade to be nicer, of course. It's very like rocky almost. So I'm going to use the crop tool again, scale it up to make sure it encompasses the whole blade. And now I'm going to adjust it to sword blade. Hand painted textures, everything else is good. And turn the denoising strength up a little. So maybe we can explain to Stable what those details are and adjust it with cracks and scratches, for example, and see where that takes us. Okay, now the results are very weird in part. So this one has like ropes tied around it, so that's complete nonsense. This one is neat. I don't love this detail here. This has an edge that I just adore. It's really cool. And this one has some runes in the middle, which is what I like about Stable Diffusion. It kind of added some detail and an idea that we didn't have before. So what I'm going to do now is take this one here, copy it in here, and add it on top with the procedure we had earlier. Just roughly put it over top. Turn the opacity back up and mask that, this bottom part out. So that's pretty cool. I really like the look of that. And I think I'm going to run this through one more time and see if we can turn this into actual runes. And before I do that, I'm going to remove this middle part. I don't understand what that's supposed to be. I mean, it looks cool, but it doesn't really make sense on a blade. So you can kind of tell by that it's AI generated. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to select this area. And in Photoshop, there's a really easy tool. It's called Content Aware Fill, which makes it much easier to remove stuff like that. And it's fine if it has like some errors like this. It doesn't really matter because we're going to feed it through an AI anyway. So all I'm going to do about that is remove the shadow here. I kind of cut it a little too small. My area that I just filled. So I'm going to cover that up. All right. And now I'm going to save it and run it through again with slight variation in the prompt. So I think this is iteration number 5 now. Yes. Bring this in here. Crop it down. And now adjust. And with sword blade with cracks and scratches, that's good. Cracks and rune decorations. And now I'm going to turn down the denoising strength so it doesn't get too creative again and see what that gives us. Okay, interesting. I honestly don't think this is much better than the first thing we put in because it did, just remove some of the cracks. I don't love that, and none of these symbols are runes. So I'm going to turn up the denoising strength in this case and see if we can maybe Photoshop out, like Photoshop the runes into the blade later in Photoshop. Interesting. So the results are now too different. That's from the denoising strength. So I'm going to turn that back down actually to around 30 and try something completely different because all I'm going for now are these decorations. So sword blade decorated with runes. Let's do Celtic runes and see what happens there. Okay, cool. So it did kind of clean up our results a little bit. I don't see any runes here, but the first one just generally looks a little more clean. It has some more detail here, some more like shading detail, which is nice, which will help us in the modeling later. And this part lost a little detail, so I'm going to, leave the original in there. But otherwise, we can copy this, bring it in, and same procedure. And here is the sword. I'm using Blender 3.3.1, but the methods I'm going to show you work in pretty much any version and should continue on into the foreseeable future. So no worries if you have a different one. This is a default installation. And the first thing we're going to do is set up our scene. So I'm going to be working from the top, right? The exact perspective of our image. So I'm going to go into Z. And now I'm going to change my view. So I'm going to go to View, Align Active Camera to View. That brings our camera here. I'm going to select said camera. And now I'm first going to change our resolution to something square. We're not going to be rendering directly. We're just going to be working here. So I'm just going to make both 1920. Just so we have a square, go into my camera settings and change the type of the camera to orthographic to make sure that it's really top down, projecting straight down. So once you've done that, we're going to bring in our reference image. So Shift A, Image, Reference. Then you go into your folder wherever you keep it and bring in your latest iteration. And now I'm going to scale that up roughly to fill our whole camera image. Should just line up pretty well. And next I'm going to parent that to my camera. So select both, then Control P, Object Keep Transform. Now what that does is it attaches the reference image to my camera. If I rotate the camera, the reference image joins us, which will become important in the next step because we're going to be rotating by 45 degrees. So RZ minus 45. And now you can see it lines up, right? The reason we made it diagonally originally is just to get as much detail as we can. And now we don't want to just rotate our object all willy-nilly in the Blender world. So this is a healthy general setup, right? And there we go. Now we're ready to work. So of course, this is the OG cube. We're going to delete that immediately. And just bring in a plane. We're going to be modeling from above. Shift A, plane, and tab into edit mode. And just start modeling, right? So this is what I was expecting. You're going to need some basic Blender skills, but nothing too fancy. So you can just vaguely get the shape done. We're going to, start with the actual blade itself. It's pointy here, just extrude. You can merge, get it to that point up there. Bring in some edge loops here, Control R. And just start getting that general shape down. All right, here's the general shape. Now you can do that middle part, right? Make sure that the blade actually can come down later. So right now we're still flat, of course. So I'm just going to loop cut into there and adjust all of that. Okay, excellent. So now we have the basic shape of the blade. Now, of course, this is still flat and the texture isn't on it yet, but that's an easy fix. That's one reason I even put the camera here in the first place, because we're going to add a material now. So go into your materials, make a material. Material 001 is just fine. And in the base color, you're going to click here and select image texture. Now you're going to open the image that you already have open, right? So click on the very left here and pick your JPEG. Now you go into the viewport shading, change your viewport shading mode to material preview, and you'll see your images on there now. Obviously completely wrong, right? But that's an easy fix. Now you're going to get into the modifiers. So go into your modifiers and add the modifier UV project. Then select your UV map. Any object will already have one. You don't need to adjust it. And as your object, select the camera itself. And boom, now you're using the camera to project your image right onto your geometry. Now, the way that works is it literally just puts the image over the top. So it isn't even stuck to the object itself. And that's exactly what we want for now while we're modeling. And then at some point, we're going to apply that. So what you're going to do next is you're going to want to actually make it three-dimensional. And the way we do that is we add another modifier called the mirror modifier and make sure the axis is not X, but Z. So we are mirroring this direction. Now what that does is it mirrors, right? It makes two versions of this. And that is exactly what we want. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move those middle areas up a little. We're going to select all of them with C, for example. You can easily select them. And we are going to GZ them up to make our blade 3D. And now you'll see if we hide our reference image, there we have the beginnings of a three-dimensional blade. Now, of course, it's far from perfect, but you can tell that we might actually get somewhere pretty soon. Now, in the materials, for example, you can turn the specular down, turn the roughness up to get rid of some of those reflections, but we'll fine-tune that later. Let's get on the remaining objects. So always make sure you keep your project clean, right? So F2 and name this plane blade. And now I'm just going to duplicate this object. So Shift D, because it has the UV project and everything already set up so nicely. So I'm not going to play around with that. And now we're going to start a little further down and make this weird little ring object here, whatever it is. And you can see the project is already working wonderfully, but I'm going to tab into edit mode and just delete everything. I'm also going to remove the mirror modifier for now because we need to create a cylinder shaped thing. And rotate that on the x-axis, go back into the other view, and just align that roughly. This helps up here. It's the X-ray mode, or Alt-Z you can click to get in there, because then you can see all of the vertices you have going on. So I'm just going to adjust all of this. The material is already on it, which is really cool. You can go into proportional editing up here and scroll wheel, change the shape, and just, move everything into place. And we can add a mirror modifier as well, right? So for that, you just delete these bottom vertices here and add a mirror modifier on the z-axis, and same difference basically. And there we go. There's our middle part. Of course, can be cleaned up more. Go to Object, Shade Auto Smooth, get rid of those sharp corners. But let's just continue. And now we move on to the hilt. Now the hilt is a little more challenging, obviously, so for all these upper things, we do have an actual top-down view, but for the hilt, we have a little bit of the bottom as well, which is super helpful to us modeling, of course, because we have textures to go on the bottom as well, but we can't just, plunk it down. If I make a flat object and project the bottom of that onto it, that doesn't make any sense. So we have to proceed a little more carefully here. We're still going to duplicate one of the objects we had earlier, but now I'm going to start with a plane again. So bring a plane in here. And this time I'm going to be modeling, just the top side of it, right? So I think even here with the mirror modifier, we can add the x-axis as well. And, but make sure that our origin is more closer to the center. So I'm going to, I'm going to shift click somewhere here, around here, and then object set origin to 3D cursor to make sure it's like more over here, right? It doesn't have to be exact. I mean, we're going to texture that differently anyway. And then keep modeling. So now I'm going to turn off clipping, select all, bring it up here, then turn clipping back on and extrude it down. Good. Now this is where we reach the limits of UV project. So I'm going to apply that and go manual, right? So what that did, of course, is now if we move the object around, the texture will stick to it. And the reason I did that is because for these sides, I'm going to manually adjust my UVs. So you can select these sides and go into UV editing. Make sure you leave on your material preview. And now you'll see that they're totally flat, of course, because they were projected from above. So we are going to project from view. I'm going to pick an angle that is somewhat similar to what I think the angle of the image is at. It doesn't mean it has to be super exact. Go into UV and then project from view. And what that did is it projected from our current view, right, that way, and makes it easier for us to actually place these UVs where we need them. Now you can see we have some side textures. Of course, they're not lined up perfectly. So we're going to select the other ones too and align them a little better. And then select those UVs, those points that don't align perfectly, press M and merge. Press M and merge. And that way, the edge will be much, much nicer. So now you can see the edge is much cleaner. We can add some loops here and there, right? So, to make those edges a little nicer. And what I'm noticing now is we seem to have a little bit of an error here. I'm sure that's a masking issue in Photoshop, so we can just go fix that real quick and just re-import. It doesn't change a thing. And now let's do these other parts. So this is where it gets a little complicated. Obviously, we don't have any sort of information on what this side looks like in our 2D image because it's just not there. So the way I do that is I improvise a little bit, right? So I'm still going to UV project and, bring that down here. But I'm going to mirror this, right? So I assume the top looks quite similar to the bottom, so why not just do the same exact thing? So I just put it here, make sure the vertices are roughly where I want them to be. And of course, what you're going to think immediately is, yeah, Albert, but it doesn't match the edge now, because obviously you can see that this part over here, that's a clear seam, especially if I go into object mode, you can see it's just solid right there. And what I'm going to do about that later is actually I'm going to texture paint, because Blender, has decently powerful texture painting tools that are enough for our purposes, where we can kind of clone tool over those and paint a little bit. And then at the very end, there's some more tricks that will help us with that. So don't fret. That's totally fine. Those are solvable problems. And now I'm just going to fix the UV map here. That changed obviously because I fixed the masking in Photoshop. And now this shape makes a lot more sense. We're also going to have to adjust the shape of that though, because that's no longer the right shape. And the same procedure on these two. Just UV project and find a spot that might look like it could work. It could look similar. And I'm thinking that's probably this area here, right? We have a bright corner up there. And just stretch that down. And already you can see, it's not incredible, but it's decent enough that we can paint over it later in Photoshop or in texture paint, depending on what we prefer. And now, of course, I can actually, I want to apply a mirror modifier, but remember, we have two axes, right? We have the one that flips it to the other side, which I want to adjust this one, but we also have the one on the Z axis, so I don't want to lose that one, which is why I'm going to add another mirror modifier and split these up. So this second one will be responsible for Z, and on the first one, I'm going to make sure it's just the X and apply that one. So now I have this side separately, which I can now adjust. And the first thing I'm going to do is select all of this and project it again and just very roughly place it on over here. And doing this, I find it really impressive that Stable Diffusion understands like sides of things. If you think about it, that's not logical for an AI by any means to realize, okay, this side of the handle needs to look the same as the other. So that always impresses me a lot. Good, so if we hide our reference image, we'll be able to see that we're making decent progress on the sword. So we have part of the handle, the blade, and now let's build the middle part of that handle. I think even with the mirroring, later we're going to paint over that to make sure it doesn't look so clearly mirrored on all of the parts. So let's get on that center piece. I'm going to copy this again because it's a really good general object. Make sure to set the origin to the geometry that puts it more in the middle. And now I'm going to delete this. And I think the vague shape of this is a cylinder. So let's try that. And in this case, I don't have to turn off the mirror modifier. because that's fine to use this way. I just don't want it when I have the cylinder turned like this, because that's kind of a problem. So just going to shape that vaguely, make sure proportional editing is on, and just make it that nice irregular shape that gives it its little fantasy vibe. Make sure we make a little more geometry so we can move it under that ring there later. And now I'm going to build that centerpiece with the emerald. So extrude, make sure proportional editing is off, and build that. And now shape these vertices into the shape of that emerald. It's almost a circle, but not quite. And now extrude that again. Proportional editing off. Scale it down. Good. And now I can select this ring and the center. Extrude it up just a little bit. And now I'm going to extrude the emerald, bring it down a little bit, extrude it again, and raise it up. And now because it's an emerald, right, it's almost a sphere in there, so I'm going to use the bevel tool, give it 3 segments, see if that's enough, and bevel it like that. And I think that should be plenty to give it the right shape. Make sure to do auto smoothing. And yeah, there's our little emerald. We obviously have a little green there and something, but we can texture paint that later. And I'm also going to bevel this round part here because I don't like how many corners it has. It's very edgy. So I'm going to Control R this and raise it up a little. And also bevel, but with just 2 segments should be plenty. And now I've fixed that. And I think actually this can afford to be a little lower, so I'm going to go down with that a little bit. Good. And now I'm seeing that the origin is not down here where I want it. So I'm going to move my cursor to selected down there and just push this whole thing down a little bit so it fits better. Okay, excellent. So that's most of that. Now I can apply the UV project modifier and do the sides, right? So as before, we have the information, the color of what that looks like on the side. So we can select that, bring it vaguely into the right perspective, and project from view. Excellent, and here's our hilt. I like this so far. This is coming out to be a pretty cool sword. You know, obviously there's some empty space here and everything, but let's finish building the general shape and then we'll go into details. So I'm actually going to create a new object with this one because it's different enough to the rest. I'm going to add a cylinder, rotate that, shade auto smooth, scale, and so forth. Add a UV project. We will need that. Simple enough to set up. Add the same exact material 001. But I'm not going to add a mirror modifier or anything quite yet because, you know, I do want it to be really round. You can see these are kind of a little flatter than they are wide, which is fine. It's like special parts on the blade, this cloth as well. It's wrapped around, but this is actually round on the handle. So I want to keep it that way and not accidentally smush it with my mirror modifier. And I'm just going to model as before, right? Show the reference. It's moved down a little bit because of, you know, this perspective thing, but that's fine. I'm just going to move the objects later. And now there's one thing I'm noticing, right? So as you can probably tell as well, this is going to be a perspective issue too. I have to switch into projection now. So I'm going to apply my UV project, go into edit mode, and first I'm going to make sure my rotation is normal again, because this reference is getting kind of crooked now. So I'm going to hide that again. And now I want to project these rings how they actually are. So now I'm going to add my mirror modifier, because now it's time, now that the projection is done and everything. And I want to do the same on both sides. Do my z-axis, actually my y-axis, because I haven't applied rotation yet. So I'm going to do that. Control A, scale, rotation. Now it's my y-axis and my z-axis. And now I'm going to fix my UVs right away. So this is kind of from a perspective from down here, which is weird because now this is kind of a perspective from like up here. So I'm going to try to imitate that as well as I can. Project from view. And actually mirror that because I kind of did the opposite. And now the same with that one. I do like how it gave us some of the same emerald material. That's kind of the cool thing about Stable. It's just a little idea it had that we can now pick up. Okay, and now of course we need to remove the ring from all of these parts, right? So I'm just going to do that quick with proportional editing, just make sure that all of the red is actually just in the red with no green details stuck in there anywhere. Now, you may be wondering, why don't I just, make seamless textures or something in Stable, which I've, proven is possible in one of my very first videos recently, a couple weeks back, because we underestimate how much detail is in these little shadows, just that the shading is correct. That's so much painting work if you're making your own painted textures that the time saving in Stable is really worth it. Especially, I'm not an illustrator. Maybe a painter can do this real quick, but I would take forever to make anything like this. So this is really a very cool and efficient workflow for me personally. So if you have a different one, I'd be glad to hear about it. But I think this is still a pretty cool way of doing things. Now, of course, we're in the early stages. People are still trying to figure out workflows. So I hope that this is kind of a contribution. I'm sure people are, a lot of you have been asking for it, and I hope this is what you were expecting. It's not quite as automatic as I was hoping for either. I spent a lot of time just kind of waiting for a tool, searching for tools, and didn't end up finding anything. But I still think it does save time compared to a traditional workflow. Now we have our rings on here. They're kind of a little thicker than they are on this handle. It did get a little misshapen, I think. So I'm going to lengthen it. It is a handle too, so I think this got a little short. So I'm going to make that longer. Make these a little bit thinner. And now, of course, we need to extrude these rings. So I'm going to do that. Select all of them and extrude along normals. That way we get, them actually ring shaped, right? And now I'm going to bevel them and hope that works. So give each of them a ring like this. Select those rings, size them up, make sure you have individual origins selected up here, turn off proportional editing, right? So they go out like this. And now bevel them, 2 segments should be fine. And there we go, that's a nice bit of handle. Might get a little stretched down here, but that's actually a detail in the original design, so not that far off. And now we can go ahead and connect that to our handle. Right, now what we're seeing is a nice little issue between this design and what actually it would look like in 3D. Namely, it is a little too big. Having something the size for a hand needs to just be thicker than this handle is designed to be. So kind of the connector between this and down here isn't clear. I guess this looks like it's on top, but that didn't really make sense to me earlier when I was modeling it. So there are a couple ways we can fix this. I would just, honestly, try to connect it here. Just bring that down, make sure clipping is on. So that's one option, you know, just kind of stretch it up here. We could also pull up the ring, actually, and just move up that whole area, you know, have it connect directly with the ring, and delete this whole part, which I think actually kind of makes sense, because that way we don't have to think too hard about what's connecting there. So I think that is what I'm going to do, and just lengthen these areas between them, stretching them a little bit, yes, but we do win a little bit more logic in our connection here. So for all that to make sense, I'm going to have to bring this down a little bit, kind of rotate it a little possibly, and adjust these connectors. Okay, excellent. And one more thing, I'm going to apply my mirror. That seems to have done really well on the sides there. And I'm going to set my origin to here. And upscale this entire handle, because it does need to be a little more massive than it was in our dainty little SD design. Cool. And now to the final part, which I think honestly will be quite simple, our end of the handle. So I'm just going to make a plane, set that up real quick. Now that we've changed our design, obviously some things are going to be in the way, so I'm going to hide those. And here's our plane, right? So I'm just going to model that real quick. And here's the vague shape. I can apply the UV project, make sure my origin is where my geometry is, and mirror, z-axis, and extrude that up the z-axis. And now we need to figure out what's actually going on here, right? It's unclear. I think this looks kind of like a blade type thing. So like if I knife tool through here, right, and bring those down, that whole area, I think that would make sense. So if I select these to show you what I mean, and bring that down, have that kind of come to a point. This last one as well. You know, not super sharp, not like flat like the blade up front, but kind of like that. And do the same on the other side. I think that's an accurate interpretation of what should be happening with this blade. This back of the hilt. Cool. And generally, I think this area up here is taller than the rest. So if this whole thing can come down, it's pretty good. And I think this should be a little wider. I'm changing the design a little bit now, but for the better, I hope. Okay, cool. And it's all solid. The sides now remain to be textured. And we just have some general problem solving to do for that. So I'm going to select them and project them from, I'd say, from the exact side, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlay them exactly on this area. While I'm at that, just make sure that nothing, really nothing, is in the black here. Just all of it out. Move it all out of the black areas. That just gives us really ugly little sides. All right, let's bring our cylinder back in and then we clean up a little. Perfect. If I put this here, just adjust that to be wide enough to kind of accept this, and bring up all the rest. And add auto smoothing. We have a general model of our sword. And I think with the techniques you saw now, you can tell why I chose something that is almost flat, right? Maybe has some basic cylinders, but it does take some time, but it can be worth it for prototyping. This is a good general weapon if you're testing out your game, haven't really worked with your designers yet, or don't have designers if you're an indie developer. You can really get pretty far. So let's fix up those holes. Cleaning up, of course, the order generally is valuable. So we named this first thing blade, that's fine. I have no idea what this is. This is like a blade protector. This is just let's actually name that blade 2, blade short. Short blade part. This is just cloth. I've been calling that cloth the whole time. This and this I will join. So Control J into the hilt. This is the actual, I'm going to call that handle, and that's back of hilt. So for now, I think I'm going to start with this cloth thingy because it's completely open and not really holding on to this blade at all. So this is obviously, if it is cloth, it needs to get a little more solid. So I can add a solidify modifier and make that a little thicker. You just give it some thickness there. I can also add a bevel modifier, if that helps. Now, I think we're a little beyond a bevel right now, so let's not do that right now. We can do that manually. And I'm going to apply that solidify and give that all some texture. So face select, if you hold... So to select a whole loop like that, you hold Alt and click. It does this. If you click an edge, you can select the other type of loop, which is what I want, because I want to texture this whole area. Then just project from view. And, you know, I'm going to be pretty lazy about this. We're going to paint anyway. Just going to move that to have some general cloth on it. I'm going to do the same with the other side. So select that whole loop. There we go. And now we fix what's underneath it, right? So there's this weird little short blade going on here. So make sure you select that and I'm just going to move that in here to kind of hide. And I'm going to close down the cloth on it with X-ray mode, making sure you get everything. I'm just going to close it down on over that blade. And now next I'm going to select all of these faces and fix that. You can also hide the stuff we've worked on, so the handle, the hilt, the cloth, the short blade part, right? And now actually apply all this before. So now this, I'm wondering what it actually is, right? So it's like a piece of metal, I guess. I'm just gonna project that and move it onto a metallic area that we have. So I'm thinking actually something like this, possibly even. Yeah, I mean, it's just a little detail we won't see very much of, so that's good. Now I'm just going to time-lapse real quick through this because I doubt that your object is going to have this very specific sword protector thing. I'm just doing the same exact thing I did with all the other objects, projecting from view, figuring out what part of the texture could work here, and just filling all the holes. This little area looks a little strange. We'll fix that in the final texturing steps. And now we can actually select all of these and join them up. So Control J, bring them into one object. Nothing breaks because we applied all the modifiers. So one thing I've noticed is obviously because of the way we made it, it's still kind of looking a little flat. You know, there's round parts and so forth, but we can make it a little more original by adjusting some height and stuff. So I'm going to resize some of this, make it a little thicker around there, right? Just some general stuff, bits and bobs to make it more interesting. What we have now is, of course, not really a pretty texture. We can't really edit it all that much. We can't go into Photoshop and really change individual parts. It's both on the same side, right? Like if we want to have an emerald just in one spot, we can't really do that. Something like that. So what we're going to do next is create an actual UV map we can work with, right? This is a total mess, overlapping everywhere. This texture is just one image, flat top down of the knife. That's not really useful. So what we're going to do next is we're going to create a new UV map. And we're going to call it baked because of what we will do later. And now we're going to select everything, go up here, UV, Smart UV Project. We want an island margin of around 0.01. That's good. Click OK. And now you'll see our new UV map. So this is the baked one. And you'll see all the different individual parts on here. This is, of course, our blade. We can recognize individual pieces here. And now we want to bake all the colors that we have, all the texture information, onto this new UV map. And the way we do that is we go into the Shading tab, and we're going to create an image that we can bake that onto. So Shift A, create an image texture, new 2048 by 2048. We're going to call that color because that's what it is, right? And here we can open it up, and you'll see it's black for now. But now we'll keep this selected. Make sure you select your new UV map, baked. Go into your render properties, switch to the Cycles render engine. Set your samples to 20. That should be plenty. You can keep all the other settings, doesn't really matter. Go down here to Bake and select Bake Type Diffuse. Make sure you only have color selected. And now we're going to hit Bake. And now here you see that we have all of our individual pieces baked onto our new texture color. And now if you want, you can switch the UV map to baked, the preview as well, and plug your new color texture into the base color of your material. And it will look the exact same to you, but will make a world of difference here with this piece because we can finally do something. First, I want to run individual pieces through Stable because, they're a little low res. I want the AI to, see some more detail in there. So we're going to save this image, make a new folder called Textures, just do the same thing again, right? Iterations. So call this 1, save it as whatever you like. PNG is just fine. And now we're going to bring this into Stable. And make sure you have a project in Photoshop ready to adjust, right? So just make one the same exact size as your texture, 2048 by 2048. And now we write our prompt. So stick to the one we had earlier, right? Hand-painted textures, that kind of thing. RPG, fantasy, and so forth, but we're not going to let it change too much, so this isn't super important. And now we just tell it what it is, right? So this is a sword blade with cracks, metal, so forth. And we crop it down to the sword blade and hope it just recognizes this part. The rest we're going to, mask out. Sampling steps, let's turn that right up to 50. Give ourselves some options, and now make sure the denoising strength is way down, like really just like 25, something like that. So what this method does, you can tell it repaints a lot of the stuff. Much of it is not useful really, but it does add some details that we may not have had earlier, because it really sees these things as individual objects, reinterprets some of them, but generally could give us some cool insights. Like this one could be kind of neat. This in my perspective is more of a metallic blade. This one has more little details here. And the shape, because we left the denoising strength so low, is still gonna work. So if we put our original one in here, right, and just put that over there after we've resized it. So I'm gonna resize this. And place that on top of there. You can really see that it's a little crisper, which is exactly what we wanted. So this is the new one, this is the old one. It really does add a little bit of detail, a little bit of some stuff that I like, but of course not all of it is good. So I'm going to mask out a ton of it and just go through it piece by piece. Right, it didn't know a lot of what this stuff was. So what I'm doing now is just adjusting this whole thing piece by piece, adjusting my prompt slightly as well, you know, putting in an emerald where the emerald is, telling it to do decorative gold elements for the handle and hilt parts, and picking out what I like, photoshopping it in, and making sure my edges don't change too much because that will cause errors in Blender later. For that same reason, I also recommend occasionally saving your texture, bringing it into Blender to check if everything is still where it's supposed to be and it's actually looking better with what you're doing and not worse. So now we come to one of the final steps, just cleaning it up with some texture painting. And that literally is going to happen within Blender. We're going to smooth over some of these awkward transitions, remove these cloned areas and so forth. But before we do that, let us make sure everything with our geometry is working well. So for example, some problems that can trip us up with texture painting are flipped normals. So in order to check those, there's a helpful tool here. You click up there and select face orientation. And you can tell immediately our handles here on the hilt are backwards. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with the normals, just make sure that they're all blue. So we can go in here to mesh, normals, recalculate outside, and that should fix our problem. If it doesn't, if it does something like this, you can just select that object individually and flip it manually. And once we fixed our normals, we can turn that right back off, the face orientation, and now we can texture paint. So the way we do that is we just switch into the texture paint mode over here, make sure we have our textures all selected, right? So this is the right image open. Here in the shading tab, we have the right image selected. And now we have tools that we might know from Photoshop already, right? So something like the clone tool, you can select the area you want to clone from with Control, and then you can just smoothly paint over these areas, you know, make sure your colors are correct and everything, but just very simply paint over here, and you should be just fine. It does work pretty well. These are all built-in features of Blender, so we should be done in no time. Just make sure your edges are all smooth, and no more dark areas like this exist, right? So make sure all the black is gone. Just paint right over that. So once you're content with your texture painting, make sure to save it. That's super important because obviously, you know, you've changed this original image that you brought in here. So I'm going to save this as another iteration. Excellent. And now we're going to make our normal map because obviously we can get a lot more detail in here with a simple trick known as normal maps. You can use something like Materialize for that or just an online service like Smart Normap, which I'm going to do because it's quick. So just Google Smart Normap. I'm going to use 2.0 and upload your image in here. And you can instantly get a nice normal map. And it really understands these little intricate details here, which is why I like using it. It's a quick way to get some more detail. So you can turn up the bias if you want, give it a little bit more detail if you so wish, but also change that in Blender later. So save an image as, and call it normal. And now in Blender, you go into your shading tab, and you can pull something out of the normal node immediately and just say normal map, normal. Bring in your image here. Change the color space to non-color because we don't want to use the color information from the normal map. We want to use it differently and plug it into color. And now, you know, you just got that little bit of extra detail in here. You can turn it up if you want more strength, make it a little crispier, and add some of that. And I'm perfectly happy with the result. And here we go, here's my final result. It looks almost exactly like what we originally generated in Stable Diffusion, except now it's a fully functional 3D asset that can be imported right into your game engine. Now, obviously, you can polish this up much more than I did. I don't have a game I'm working on right now, but if you do, just spend a little more time and I'm sure you'll get a fantastic result. If you get a better result than I do, I'd love to see it. So feel free to tweet that result at me on Twitter @AlbertBeausezon. And comment below if you have any suggestions on how this could be improved. I'm sure this isn't the last time I'm going to be making a video like this because this tech is improving all the time and people are just now figuring out workflows that work well with this. So I'd love to hear your opinion on this. And I'd love to have your subscription. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out my other ones and leave a subscription, as 8,000 of you have already done. So thank you so much for supporting me like this. Your subscription is worth a ton and I love all that positive feedback you've been sending me. So keep that up. Have fun with Stable Diffusion. I'm Albert Beausezon, and I hope to see you very soon.